Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about cycling and climate change in Ontario. My name is Jamie Stuckless, and I'm the Executive Director of the Share the Road Cycling Coalition. For those of you who are not familiar with Share the Road, we are a provincial cycling advocacy nonprofit that has been working since 2008 with the goal of building a more bicycle-friendly Ontario, where everyone feels safe riding a bicycle. And we do this work through our three pillars of advocacy, building capacity, and changing the conversation. Very briefly, as advocates, we work to be at Queen's Park advocating for legislation and policies that make it safer to ride a bike, like the 1 meter safe passing law. And we've also advocated for over 120 million of provincial funding for cycling infrastructure across Ontario. When it comes to building capacity, we work through our Bicycle Friendly Community Awards program to work with hundreds of municipalities across Ontario to help them chart a path towards a more bicycle-friendly future. We also host our annual Ontario Bike Summit, which is a gathering of about 300 road safety and cycling stakeholders who come together every year to share best practices and be inspired in their work. And lastly, we're always working with partners and with the province to change the conversation about cycling and running public awareness campaigns and cycling and driver education. And the reason that we do the work that we do is because there are people cycling in Ontario who need our roads to be safer. We know from our most recent poll that 6% of Ontario residents are already cycling daily or almost daily. In addition to that 6%, we know that 32% of Ontario residents would actually like to be cycling as their main mode of transportation for the trip to work. So there is actually a huge demand for cycling that isn't yet being met. We also know that most residents in Ontario believe that there are universal benefits to municipalities and the province making cycling safer. Ontario residents believe that getting more people on bikes benefits everyone, not only those who cycle. In addition to having public support for encouraging cycling, we also do this work because we know that cycling can be a useful tool for helping to mitigate climate change. In Ontario, the transportation sector accounts for 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and car travel specifically is 1/5 of our overall greenhouse gas emissions. So while we don't have currently an agreed upon calculation for the greenhouse gas savings specifically from switching from a car to a bike, what we have seen is studies like the one in Montreal that showed that for every 7% increase in their cycling network, they actually observed a 2% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So making that link between municipalities providing more safe spaces to cycle and more people cycling and reducing their greenhouse gas emissions through transportation. And so one of the things that we do here quite often when we talk to individuals and municipalities about mitigating climate change through cycling is we hear that not every trip is bikeable. And we definitely agree. It's not possible to take every single trip that's out there by bike, but our goal is not for every trip to be done by bike. It's to provide options so that trips that can be done by bicycle can be made that way. And so what we see is when we look at municipalities and people's daily travel patterns, most trips are actually under 5 kilometers, which for many people can be a very bikeable distance. So for the trips that are very long, we're not saying that you should ride a bike if you don't want to, but it's about finding those trips in your day that are short enough to take by bike. We also hear about concerns about carrying family and groceries, and increasingly there are options for people to add baskets, panniers, and trailers to their bicycle to increase the bikeability of many trips. We also know that biking can be a really great way to connect to transit for those longer trips. And there's a lot that municipalities and the province can do to make it safer to both cycle to and park your bike at transit. And not only can this help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions of short trips to transit stations, it can also reduce the need to provide a lot of parking around transit and make transit more appealing to more people and hopefully increase transit usage in your community as well. And lastly, to circle back to the point that it's really about providing options to residents. There is a demand for more options and making it possible for your residents to choose how they get around based on the purpose of the trip and not necessarily feeling like they have to take a car every time they leave the house. So there's a lot of municipal opportunities to engage in the work of mitigating climate change by promoting cycling. As I've just covered, there's a lot of opportunities through individual trips and helping your residents get on bikes, as well as leveraging cycling to help increase connectivity to transit. But there's also opportunities for municipalities to look at how they regulate and encourage e-mobility to help more people discover cycling and wheeling. So we're seeing a lot of growth and demand for e-bicycling across Ontario, mainly because e-bikes give people that extra push that they need to bike a little further, to bike up that hill, maybe to carry some extra groceries on their bike, or bike later in life as well. So, municipalities play an important role in regulating where e-bikes can be in their community and to make sure that your trails and bike lanes and bike paths and roads are as accessible and safe for e-bikes as possible so that more people can hop on bikes and reduce their climate change impact. There's also an opportunity, as I'll speak to, for municipalities to help people discover additional modes of low speed, low carbon impact modes of mobility, like kick-style e-scooters, which is what you'll see pictured here in this slide. And these were recently legalized in Ontario with the province's framework for kick-style e-scooters. And there's an opportunity for municipalities to pass a local bylaw and make these accessible to residents, both as a way of getting around town, for recreation, for tourism, and to connect to transit. And lastly, I wanted to touch on opportunities around e-cargo cycles because they not only increase mobility for residents and for families, they're also an interesting opportunity for municipalities to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions impact of their own municipal fleets. And that's the second picture that you'll see on this slide. This is actually a photo from a pilot project in 2019, I believe, in the city of Toronto. Several municipalities around the world are looking for ways to minimize the impact of their municipal fleet by adding cargo cycles and e-cargo cycles, which is a really great way to not only help provide more accessibility for your community and reduce your greenhouse gas emissions in your fleet, but it can also increase road safety by reducing the number of large vehicles that are out on your roads. So some real opportunities to look at your municipal fleet as well. So I did want to touch on, we are obviously all COVID-19 and the pandemic is front of mind for all of us. And I wanted to touch a little bit on how this impacts mobility because it has had a big impact on mobility and how municipalities are providing transportation options to residents. So throughout the course of the pandemic, we've seen an increased demand for cycling and walking as a mode of transportation, recreation, and tourism. And municipalities around the world have been responding to this demand by rebalancing streets. And so that's finding ways to create more space on the road, on trails, and in community for people to walk and cycle safely and for them to do so in a physically distanced way. So there's actually an online global database right now that's tracking efforts of street rebalancing around the world. And I believe they're up to over 800 actions in almost 400 cities around the world. And as much as this is a global trend, many municipalities right here in Ontario have gotten on board and either released pandemic mobility plans or taken immediate action to make cycling and walking safer. So I'm looking at Mississauga, Markham, Guelph, Toronto, Ottawa, and the National Capital Commission, Hamilton, and North Bay as some of the examples of communities that have taken initiative to create more space for walking and cycling. And so obviously this is a very important part of a pandemic response plan, but there's also conversations underway in terms of what longer term impacts this could have on people's mobility as well as climate mitigation through transportation. And so I just wanted to close by reviewing some of the specific actions that municipalities like yours can take in the next year to increase cycling in your community. And I'll touch first on, again, related to pandemic mobility because that is front of mind. So if you're looking in your municipality to create more spaces for cycling and for walking, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities has recently released a guide to help municipalities do just that. us at Share the Road, along with our partners at the Center for Active Transportation, have been hosting a series of webinars that share best practices about street rebalancing and making more space for cycling and walking, which you can check out anytime. They are recorded on our website, sharetheroad.ca. Another pandemic response measure that has recently been put in place was an announcement by the federal government of a $3 billion funding stream for resiliency infrastructure in municipalities. And one of the pieces of infrastructure that can be funded through this stream is active transportation infrastructure. So we encourage all municipalities to look at how they can leverage this fund to create more safe spaces for cycling and walking in their community, both as a response to the current pandemic and for the longer term to help more residents get on their bikes and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions related to our transportation. And the last two pieces I wanted to touch on are related to e-mobility specifically. As I mentioned, Ontario now has a pilot framework to allow the use of kick-style e-scooters. However, municipalities need to pass a bylaw to actually permit the e-scooters to operate in their community. So if this is something that your municipality has not yet done, feel free to connect with us. We have some resources and best practices on our website, sharetheroad.ca, for regulating e-scooters in your community, and you're also welcome to reach out to us directly to discuss that. But we wanted to flag specifically around e-bicycles. I think there's some really big changes happening in promoting and encouraging e-bikes across Canada. So recently, Transport Canada did announce that they are downloading the definition of e-bikes to the provinces. So we might be changing very soon how we define and regulate e-bikes, and that's something I wanted to make sure is on your radar for you to engage in any municipal consultations led by the province and to make sure that your communities are built in a way that will make it easy and fun and accessible for people to ride e-bikes on your trails and on your streets. So thank you very much again for your time. I'll close with this last invitation. If you'd like to continue the conversation with us at the annual Ontario Bike Summit this November in a virtual fashion, please do, and check us out again, sharetheroad.ca. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Professor Greg Evans. I am the Director of the Southern Ontario Centre for Atmospheric Aerosol Research, or SOCAR for short. In this presentation, I will describe how air quality in Ontario changed during the COVID-19 shutdown. To start, I will acknowledge my co-author, Dr. Chol Jong, and the Ontario Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks for providing some of the data I will present. I should note that many of these data I will show are hot off the press and have not yet undergone full quality assurance. Reducing emissions for municipalities offers a major opportunity to increase sustainability. These emissions can both contribute to climate change and detract from air quality. Traffic is a major source of many pollutants in Ontario. We have been studying traffic emissions for a long time. The analysis I will present is a follow-up to the research we have been doing with government partners for almost a decade. The most recent outcome from this was a report released in November 2019 on near-road traffic pollution based on a study conducted in Toronto and Vancouver. This study involved collecting data for 2 years at 6 sites. We used a wide range of instrumentation, some conventional, some more advanced, that measured a wide range of gas and particle phase pollutants, operating with time resolutions ranging from collecting samples over 24 hours to making measurements every second. The study involved 23 scientists and was a partnership between SOCAR and partners at all 3 levels of government, federal, provincial, and municipal. The main findings were that traffic has a substantial impact on air quality near major roads and that highly emitting diesel trucks make a disproportionate contribution. So what would happen if we reduced the number of vehicles on our roads? This work, recently released by Professor Marianne Hatsopoulou and her PhD student Laura Minette, provides some useful insight based upon emissions modeling for the Greater Toronto Hamilton area. A number of scenarios were considered, and I will only describe 2 of them here. One, electrification of half the cars on the road, and the second one, replacing all the older trucks that no longer comply with modern emission standards. There certainly are other strategies to reduce the number of cars, such as increased active transportation and greater adoption of public transit that I will not discuss. This study found that electrifying half the cars would provide $1.2 billion per year in social benefits in terms of improved health and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 11,600 megatons per day of CO2 equivalent. Similarly, removing all the old trucks would provide $2.1 billion per year in improved health and reduce the emissions by 185 tons per day of CO2 equivalent. These savings would be sufficient to allow government to provide incentive funding of $10,000 per car and over $300,000 per truck. I note that this represents about 25% of the cost of the car and over 100% of the cost of a new truck. This work was based upon modeling. How do we know if it would actually achieve this type of return on investment? Well, we can look at that through measurement. The recent shutdown due to the COVID-19 pandemic provided an unprecedented natural experiment. It allowed us to make measurements of how the air quality changed when approximately half the vehicles on the roads were taken off. For example, I'm showing here a graph of the traffic volume on College Street. College Street is a typical arterial road in downtown Toronto. You can see that reduction of traffic occurred after March 13th. I should note that we've included 1 week of transition, March 14th to 20th, to allow a clear separation between a pre-shutdown and the shutdown periods that I will be comparing in upcoming slides. I will also bring in a recovery period in later slides. Did this change in traffic produce an observable change in the concentration of air pollutants? The short answer is yes, but, and I will get to that in a bit. I'm showing here a graph of the concentration of ultrafine particles. These are the smallest particles, typically smaller than 100 nanometers in diameter, and they get released by tailpipes. We measure them in terms of the number of particles per cubic centimeter. A clean room might have 5,000 particles per cubic centimeter, which means you inhale several million of them with every breath. As you can see in this figure, the concentration on College Street is typically above 10,000 particles per cubic centimeter. If we compare the concentrations during the shutdown period with the concentrations prior to the shutdown period, you can see a reduction of about 40%. However, there are other ways to do these comparisons. One way is to compare similar time periods in previous years. I'm showing here concentrations for the 3 years 2017 to 2019. If we do a comparison here, we compare these graphs for 2017 to 2019 versus the concentrations we had during the same time period in the shutdown, you can get a concentration change of about 40% as well. So both methods we use here give us about the same result. If we look at another important traffic pollutant, nitrogen oxides, the situation becomes less clear. Much of the nitrogen oxides in cities come from diesel vehicles, both on roads such as delivery trucks and off roads such as construction vehicles. You may have seen some dramatic satellite pictures of how nitrogen dioxide concentrations decreased in cities during the shutdown. If we compare the measured concentrations on College Street during the shutdown to the pre-shutdown concentrations, there was a drop of about 36%. The challenge is that nitrogen oxides normally drop in spring anyway due to the increased amount of sunshine as the days get longer. You can see this if we compare the concentrations from the 3 prior years, 2017 to 2019, where there was a drop in concentrations occurring anyway at the same time period. A second challenge is that the concentrations in 2020 were lower than those typical for 2017 to 2019 anyway to start with. So this complicates the picture. We can see that there is a difference of about 42% between the concentrations in previous years to the concentrations during the shutdown during the same time period. However, as I indicated, the concentrations are lower to start with, so we need to calculate what is the excess change, how much more it changed in 2020 due to the shutdown alone and not due to these other completing factors. I'm going to come back to this. Another dimension to this is that the improvements in air quality were not necessarily the same everywhere. I will show this by comparing the data for College Street with data for a site on Highway 401. To simplify these comparisons, I'm going to use 4 periods. The first period is the pre-shutdown period, leading up to March 14th. The second is what we've referred to as the shutdown period. The third is a transition period, because as you can see, the traffic on Highway 401 started to increase between April and mid-May. And the final is the recovery period, which goes from late May into June. You can see that the traffic started to creep up much more noticeably on Highway 401 much earlier, whereas on College Street, the traffic volume, shown here in the number of vehicles per hour, remained low and still hasn't recovered to what it was prior to the shutdown. So let's see how the concentration of pollutants changed at these two locations during these 4 periods. I'm comparing here the concentrations in dark bars for 2020 during the pre-shutdown, the shutdown 1, shutdown 2, and transition. And I'm also showing light bars for the prior years, 2017 to 2019. I'm comparing the concentrations of ultrafine particles at College Street and the 401 as well. If we look at the difference between the concentrations during the shutdown period to the pre-shutdown period, at both locations there's a drop of about 25%. Here are some similar graphs for black carbon, or soot as you may call it. Black carbon is emitted by diesel vehicles. It's a climate forcing agent that's much more potent than carbon dioxide, but it also has a much shorter atmospheric lifetime. Hence, targeting black carbon is one good strategy for getting a quicker response to carbon mitigation policies. Black carbon is also used in workplace settings, such as mines, as a marker for exposure to diesel exhaust. The Netherlands has recommended an occupational standard of 1,000 nanograms per meter cubed, which is about the level that you would normally encounter on Highway 401. There was a definite reduction in the black carbon concentrations if we compare the pre-shutdown to the shutdown periods. The reduction was about 30% on College Street and 25% on the 401. I should note that the levels on College Street were much lower in 2020 than they were in the previous years, and this was due to nearby construction activity on College Street. That was less in 2020. Finally, I return to the change in concentration of nitrogen oxides. Even though there was a drop in concentration during the shutdown, and they are lower than they were in 2017-19, it's still not clear how much of the drop can be attributed to the shutdown. For example, there was certainly a drop during the shutdown, but you can see in previous years there was also a drop over this period as well. The concentrations during the shutdown are lower than they were in previous years, but they were lower than they were pre-shutdown as well. Thus, we need to look at the excess, the difference that can be attributed to the shutdown. And this is only about 10% on College Street or 15% on 401. And this is a bit puzzling because given the drop in traffic volume that occurred, we expected to see a larger drop. This raises questions about how well can we measure and monitor the improvements in air quality that we should achieve through large-scale interventions such as a rapid or a dramatic drop in traffic volume. We can see similar patterns if we look at the change in nitrogen oxides at sites across Ontario. Here we have sites ranging from some that are rural, some that are outside of cities, some that are inside cities, and some that are close to major roadways. What we're comparing is the percentage drop of nitrogen oxides during the COVID shutdown. We're showing what the drop was in 2020 as a percentage, and we're showing the similar drop during the previous years, 2017 to 19. What we'd expect is that these black bars should always show a higher percentage than what normally occurs during this period, which is the yellow bars. You can see that we typically have about a drop of about 30% during this period due to the seasonality. In some places, we did see drops that exceeded what we would normally expect. For example, if we look at these sites here, we have Oshawa, Barrie, Peterborough, Toronto sites that showed a reduction that was definitely larger than would normally occur during this period. However, in some other sites, in Hamilton in particular, the drop that we saw during the 2020 shutdown was actually much smaller than what we normally see, and this also raises some questions. Now let's turn our attention to carbon dioxide. This is certainly a key pollutant in relation to climate. However, the analysis is not straightforward. Carbon dioxide has a global background of about 400 parts per million. This background also changes as we approach summertime due to increased photosynthesis, so you can see it's dropping. So if we want to look at how the concentration of carbon dioxide changed during the shutdown, we have to take both these trends into account and look at the excess carbon dioxide above this background. One strategy is to remove the background carbon dioxide from the total so that we only have the carbon dioxide that is in excess of this background. We use a range of strategies to do this. In this case here, I'm using what's called a spline of minima, where you look at the minimum values over time and consider that as the background, and everything on top of that is due to the local traffic. If we consider just this local CO2, the amount of carbon dioxide above the background, we can see that there was a 40% reduction on College Street and only a 20% reduction on 401. Why was it lower on the 401? Well, approximately 30% of the carbon dioxide on Highway 401 comes from trucks, while the remaining 70% comes from cars. On College Street, only about 15% comes from the trucks. As I'll show you in a bit, the cars and the truck traffic volume change by different amounts. In particular, the volume of trucks on the 401 did not drop anywhere near as much as the volume of cars, whereas on College Street it was about the same. This makes sense because even during the shutdown we still needed all our goods and our groceries, and hence there was less effect on the carbon dioxide on the 401. You can see that now in the recovery period, we're back to the typical concentrations at both locations. We can use a similar strategy of background subtraction to look at how the local carbon monoxide changed at the two sites. Carbon monoxide is a better marker of pollutants from cars, as most of the emissions are from cars, even on the 401, where only 20% of the carbon monoxide comes from the trucks. In this figure, I am comparing the local carbon monoxide at both sites. As you can see, the carbon monoxide on College Street dropped by about 50% during the shutdown. The reduction on Highway 401 is about 30%. This is close to the expected reduction based on traffic alone, which should be about 35%. To understand these results, we need to look once again at how traffic changed, and we need to look in somewhat more detail. On College Street, the car and truck traffic decreased by about half, and it's still low. This helps explain some of the results, but not others. For example, the carbon monoxide also dropped by about half, and the carbon dioxide concentrations dropped by about 40%, which is close to the value of half. However, the black carbon and ultrafine concentrations only dropped by about 30%, whereas the nitrogen oxide concentrations only dropped by about 10%. Moreover, the carbon dioxide concentrations on College Street are returning to their original values, whereas the traffic has not. Why did the nitrogen oxides drop by so little compared to the traffic? Why is the carbon dioxide recovering faster than the traffic? The situation for Highway 401 is more complicated, as the car traffic initially dropped by about 40%, but is now only down by about 20% of what it was originally. The truck traffic initially dropped by only about 15%, is now even higher than normal. The ultrafine black carbon and carbon monoxide all dropped initially by about 30%, while the carbon dioxide dropped by 20% and the nitrogen oxides by 10%. These reductions are roughly consistent with those expected for carbon monoxide and black carbon, higher than expected for ultrafine and lower than expected for carbon dioxide and nitrogen oxides. Clearly, there are questions that still remain. Finally, let me say a few words about particulate matter 2.5. These are particles smaller than 2.5 microns, and we refer to them as PM 2.5. There were small reductions in the PM 2.5 at the Highway 401 site and no measurable reductions at the College Street site. PM 2.5 is actually a mix of many pollutants. Some, like nitrate, decrease in the springtime, while others, like organic aerosol, increase. These larger patterns tend to counterbalance and overshadow the more subtle and perhaps important changes in the particulate matter from vehicles, cook-ins, brakes, and tires. We're busy doing analysis now to see if we can dig down and see how the concentrations of particulate matter from these sources, such as the brakes, the cook-in, tires, did change, and whether we can measure noticeable change. So this brings us to the end of our little road trip, with a few answers and many more questions. As I indicated at the start, these data are all hot off the press, the work is still in the early stages, and all these findings are preliminary. Some of the questions will inevitably get resolved through more comprehensive and thorough data analysis over the upcoming months. So what can we say at this point? The COVID shutdown had a substantial impact on air quality that varied across pollutant and locations. The reductions were similar to, and in some cases exceeded, those estimated by Marian Hatsopoulou for ambitious scenarios such as electrification of half the car fleet or retirement of old trucks. Scenarios that she showed could yield substantial gains in terms of reduced greenhouse gas emissions and reduced healthcare costs. This certainly supports that encouraging sustainability policies along these lines can achieve benefits. Steps that municipalities could take towards this might include development of low emission zones around facilities such as schools, daycares, and long-term care homes, or requiring the use of low emission vehicles within tenders. However, this analysis also suggests that the infrastructure and data analysis strategies we have at the moment may not be adequate to comprehensively measure these benefits in terms of air quality. Hence, what needs to change? We will continue our analysis with this question in mind. What infrastructure does Ontario need to put in place if the goal is to be able to detect the benefits of widespread policies towards a more sustainable future? Thank you very much for your attention.
Hi everybody, hope you're having a great day and welcome to the 2020 AMO Virtual Conference. I'm so glad that you're able to join this presentation and that you've taken the time to join this presentation to discuss a little bit about putting a climate lens onto our COVID response and recovery plans. So I'm Gabriella Kovacs. I'm the Executive Director of an environmental organization called the Clean Air Partnership. We work with municipalities to help them implement clean air and climate change actions. And mainly how we go about doing that is we research and policies and practices that are being undertaken all across the world. We help to facilitate that knowledge transfer from those who have already undertaken those actions to share their experiences with those who are considering taking those actions and putting them into play. We convene networks to help facilitate and jointly develop policies and actions and implement them. And we also, all of this leads towards catalyzing bold climate action. A lot of our resources are all available on our Clean Air Partnership website, which is linked there. And I do hope that you check out our organization and the great resources that are available to you there. So how this started out is we've been working with municipalities to help them really develop a climate lens to apply to their municipal decision making. Really, it comes down to the key questions. how is this decision going to either affect climate, either in the production of greenhouse gas emissions, or be affected by climate through in terms of extreme weather or exposure to temperature increases, precipitation, but really trying to understand what does this decision mean and how is it connected to climate, and how does it either support our climate action and climate emergency declarations, or how does it undermine them? And what can we do to improve our climate and our climate perspective that we apply to our municipal decision making? There is a climate lens tool that's available on our website. Keep in mind, it's a very simple kind of analysis. It really just kind of identifies if this decision has any climate connection, and if so, then it's kind of gears the staff, for municipal staff person, towards helping them meet with their climate person within their municipality to kind of explore what now. Now that we've determined that this decision actually has an impact on climate or is impacted by climate, what do I do now? So that kind of helps them to kind of connect up with their climate change person, which helps to help a lot of that facilitation that needs to take place at the municipal level. But it also really helps to kind of identify where are we going and how are we making sure that we're putting our climate emergencies into our decision making over the long term. If you don't have the resources within your municipality on the climate actions, please just reach out to us. We're here to help. We really want to kind of understand how municipalities are bringing climate into their municipal decision making, and we're here to help kind of understand what you need to do and how we can help you do that. So as part of when the COVID lockdown happened and we were all sitting trying to figure out what do we do and what does this mean, I think one of the key things that we all wanted to do is we thought, well, okay, we know we have this major issue that we have to deal with. We know that climate is our longer term challenge and marathon that we have to run. What can we do to help apply a climate lens to our COVID response and recovery? So the response really spoke to what we were kind of doing on the immediate terms to help people with physical distancing, and the longer term in terms of our response is how do we actually get back to whatever our new normal is, and then how do we actually ensure that the decisions we're making and moving forward will actually help us with our climate change challenge that's ahead of us. And I think one of the first things that people, when we kind of crowdsourced this effort, we really did kind of want to speak to, we knew that no one person has the ability to apply this kind of climate lens to our COVID response and recovery all alone. We had a much better chance of being able to do that if we all work collectively together to brainstorm what is the COVID and climate connections. And one of the first ones that really kind of identified is that COVID is an immediate response. You cannot ignore it. I mean, people try, but you can't ignore it. Really, when it comes down to it, we recognize that the kind of climate change as a longer term strategy and a longer term challenge is very much along for like COVID on steroids, in the sense that it's immediate, it's response, we have to deal with it right away, we can't ignore it. We have death that's kind of occurring just within a couple of weeks of getting COVID. Climate change is a much longer drawn out process. We are having climate change impacts happening right now, but we don't necessarily have that same sort of acute issue. It's more of a chronic, longer term issue. And in many ways, that kind of the very death rate, like, people were at the beginning when COVID first started happening, people were kind of comparing the death rates with regards to flu as opposed to COVID. And in many ways, the very death rate of COVID is also a very kind of similar analogy for the difference between the 1.5 degrees Celsius, the 2 degrees Celsius, the 3, the 4 degrees Celsius. And that is really, really critical. If we don't do anything about climate change, it's kind of along the lines of actually responding to COVID by not putting any measures in place, by allowing our healthcare system to be overrun, to not being able to supporting our population. And so it really does have this analogy for what we need to do from our COVID response to our longer term climate change challenge that's ahead of us. And really, when it comes down to it, we've been looking at it from the perspective, delaying and responding to the clear evidence of threats, whether from pandemics or from climate change. It is going to increase human and socioeconomic costs over our long term. Denial is not a strategy for COVID, and it is not a strategy for climate change. What also became very, very clear is that no one can take on this challenge and solve this problem alone. It is individuals have a role to play. They need to physically distance. They need to not get into gatherings with other people, but individuals on their own cannot do that. Businesses can play a role, but the businesses in themselves, they are critical in terms of the work that they do and the requirements that they do to reduce COVID impacts, but they cannot do it alone. It is only through the collective and aligned action between government, businesses, individuals, healthcare sectors, every sector of society working together that we can take on this challenge. And climate change is also very, very similar to that as well. Equity has huge impacts on exposure, impacts, and outcomes. Climate change will have huge impacts on exposure, impacts, and outcomes. We know that equity is a big component, not only of COVID, but of climate change as well. And so I think one of the key things that is just, I think it's just been a little bit of a hit in the face. It's always something that we've recognized that was something, but we again try to ignore it. And we do like to live in denial. I know myself, I do as well. Equity really has a huge impact from COVID, and it will have a huge impact for climate change. So it's really important to bring equity into our decision making and into our climate lens as we move forward. As you can see, again, the same sort of kind of impacts on average home exposure of fine particulate matter. We know that there's a huge amount of equity components. And I would really encourage that as your municipalities respond to your climate emergencies by addressing developing climate action plans and implementing them, that equity becomes a key component of those climate action plans. It's not just something that's taken on the side, but it becomes a lens that we also apply to our whole climate action. Air pollution, significant impacts from a COVID perspective. Air pollution will be exacerbated by climate change as well. Increased temperatures will increase the ozone formation. It will have a huge impact in terms of exposure to air pollution over the long term. We know that we can put measures into place. Now, I am not suggesting that we shut down our economy as an air pollution strategy. Not at all. Never, ever would I ever suggest that. What I think we really kind of take as the lesson of this COVID experience that we've had is that we can put measures in place that can address our air pollution. It's not just shutting down our economy. We know that we can need to put transportation measures in place, not just to respond to COVID, but to respond to climate change as well. And all of this will help with regards to reducing air pollution burden as well. And we will speak to some of the kind of conversations that we had when we go through the climate lens tools. I really did want to kind of highlight again the equity considerations on this one, but really what it comes down to it, timing, preparation, listening to the science and facts, leadership, collective action, individual actions, transparency, honesty, huge. It all matters, and it's critical for COVID, and it's critical for climate. So one of the first things that we, the first sectors that we kind of tried to tackle when we did our COVID lens, COVID and climate lens alignment was green space. Everybody was speaking to how important green space was, how finally when we weren't allowed to access our green space in the way that we normally do, we realized just how much we appreciate it and how much we need it. When it really comes down to it, I'm going to speak to green spaces, it's parks, it's ecosystems, it could be public little squares. I'm not only going to speak to kind of like that kind of communal gathering spaces, it's public spaces. Ideally, it would have green infrastructure as part of it, but public space as a whole, I'm going to also kind of consider part of that as well. And one of the key things that people came up with some brilliant ideas in terms of one-way pathways, moving directions and putting pathways, putting the little bubbles to kind of help people with design for how to kind of maintain physical distancing while still encouraging access to green space and recognizing the important role green space plays in exercise, mental health across our communities. Green space, in addition, the green space climate and health connections, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, improved sequestration of carbon, air quality improvements, reducing the urban heat island effect, reducing flooding as it regards to dealing with precipitation on site, providing physical exercise and obesity interventions, improving community cohesion, And I can't speak to how important community cohesion is, especially as we have these crises like COVID and climate change moving forward, reducing air pollution and improving habitat and agriculture. Also wanted to kind of highlight one of the key questions that people started asking themselves as we were crowdsourcing the green space COVID climate connections was, can our COVID experience build a new approach to city planning that brings open spaces, watersheds, forests, and park into the heart of how we think about and plan our communities? And I think the answer really came out absolutely. Our COVID experience has changed the way we look at our green space, not just in the public realm, but hopefully in the municipal realm as well. The sheer importance of our green space and what that plays in terms of our livability, our communities. What also became very clear in a lot of municipalities was that green space is not distributed equitably across our communities. There are certain sections of our community that have far more access to green space than others. So that became one of the key kind of action items coming out of the crowdsourcing. Really, the question came into it. The Windsor is an example. In their Rediscover Our Parks, they brought equity into access to green space. They mapped out the prioritization, looking at it from the perspective. Not surprisingly, what they did find is that the older parts of their community, the lower economic sectors of their community, are also the ones that have a deficit of green space. One of the key areas that was looking at it, Oshawa was really trying to say, like, how do we, first question, do we bring green space into our consideration, and what's the criteria that we do to identify priority neighborhoods? And if not, that is a really important thing for us to do. Bring green space into a criteria of how we identify those parts of our community that are needing it more investment than others, just to try and address past inequities and past lack of access. Again, Peel Region Priority Planning Mapping Tool provides some insights on that one as well. So those are some examples of how municipalities have put that equity, distribution, prioritization, green space into their municipal decision making. Food security became a very big issue in terms of the community gardening. That was one of the key areas that was identified at first. It was not identified as an essential service, and then after further consideration, it was identified as an essential service for very good reasons. And really what it came down to it is like, these are opportunities for urban agricultural plans, actually looking at it from the perspective of like opportunities for rural communities to be able to increase their viability from the agricultural sector and local food opportunities, making opportunities to kind of like expand the supply chain of their food development, so that kind of really addressing that key need that's been identified amongst the populations, that we can't rely on international supply chains for our food, something as essential as our food security. The recognition of our local capacity within our province, within our region, to be able to provide us with our local food is really, really important. And I think it provides a huge opportunity for looking at our food strategies are to be able to take advantage of the recognition of the sheer importance of local food securitization. So again, from the perspective, even outside of the larger, bigger urban agricultural strategies that municipalities might have, community gardening was also recognized, not only from the perspective of actually providing a food supply, but also for that social cohesion it brings. And the one question that really came out is, how equitably does it serve our residents? Do all residents have access to community gardening? Do we actually have a recognition that there's certain segments of our population who don't have outdoor space, who may not be able to actually grow food in their backyards? How do we prioritize them to be able to make sure that they're giving them community gardening opportunities? Looking at it from the backyard, like people in balconies, how do we encourage and train and support people to do balcony gardening? Or even taking unused space along the municipalities, like either the right of way or in certain parts of the community that are underused space, and turn them into community gardening opportunities. We did a whole big section on road space reallocations, but I'm going to leave it to Jamie to take all of that. She's going to do a fantastic job of sharing all of that information. The one I did want to kind of speak to in terms of transportation is telecommuting. So really what it came down to it, some municipalities have had telecommuting policies in place and HR policies in place, but it hasn't really necessarily reached the stage where it could have. COVID did highlight of how much we are able to achieve by working from home, even if it does isn't the best scenario that we want in terms of the social interactions. So one of the key things that has really been coming into place is that we recognize that we are very effective at home in terms of our job productivity, but we also need that social kind of cohesion. So whenever we kind of come out to the whatever the new normal is on the other side of this, and we recognize that we have this opportunity to take telecommuting more as a viable HR strategy and enable our staff people to be able to achieve the best of both worlds is what I'm trying to kind of aim for. So the telecommuting from the best of both worlds, the productivity at home, the work-life balance, the increased productivity, the cost effectiveness, all of those things, while also recognizing the really sheer important role that social interaction plays and networking plays, so that it's not an either or, but how do we bring them together better so that they can, again, get the best of both worlds. So telecommuting, really policies over the long term. Some of the key things that really came into it. What are some of the enabling factors that really need to be in place? In terms of our phone systems, in terms of being able to kind of have some flexibility in terms of our remote accessing, our computer accessing. High-speed internet connection is critical, and a lot of places in Ontario do not have access to high enough internet connections that would make telecommuting a viable option for them. That's something that we need to recognize. That's an equity issue as well, and something that we need to improve upon. Communication tools, really kind of remote access, using using a lot of the Zoom recordings that are on right now. Project management tools in terms of work planning virtually, really, really important on those kind of components. Cloud-based file sharing is another key area. Again, that's doing things again with the project management tools as well. One of the things that really did come into play is that this is actually, I'm going to go back into the telecommuting. One of the key things that we did identify is that one of the things we want to avoid on this one is telecommuting has a huge opportunity as a transportation demand management strategy. We know that as people kind of go back into workplaces, that we're going to have a huge amount of transportation challenges and huge disruptions coming our way. We really should consider telecommuting as a viable transportation option that we need to consider. However, in order to do that, it really is important that we develop telecommuting policies, and more importantly, that we actually have a kind of ongoing evaluation, scenario playing on how these scenarios can undermine telecommuting or undermine social cohesion in the workplace or undermine individuals' mental health or productivity. So we all need to kind of crowdsource that element to kind of understand how do we better find the best of both worlds. And that's something that we've added as a to-do list to the Clean Air Partnership work that we're doing with municipalities. So stay tuned for that. We will be kind of sharing some more information over the coming months. Other kind of COVID climate considerations that I did want to kind of share, from an economic recovery perspective, I cannot tell you how important it is in terms of building back better, and our energy efficiency, in particular energy efficiency work in terms of the retrofits that need to take place to bring us to our climate change goals, in terms of improving our workplace elements, in terms of improving our grid, in terms of not necessarily relying on natural gas to meet our peakers, but actually finding ways to kind of make it so that we can get our renewable energy and keep par with the rest of where the rest of the world is going on renewable energy within our electricity system. EV uptake is definitely something that's going to be kind of an opportunity in terms of our economic stimulus as well. Active mobility, I can't speak to how important that is, not only from a transportation perspective, especially when people are hesitant to use public transit, but also from a public health perspective and how critical that is to maintaining the sustainability of our public healthcare system. We need to rely a lot more on bringing prevention and health promotion into our everyday lives in order to save our healthcare system over the long term. Natural capital assets is another key area that's really, really critical as well. So really in terms of how we can take our COVID response and recovery and invest it in ways that save us money and taxpayer dollars over the longer term. That really is one of the critical things about identifying. It's not just necessarily creating jobs, but where it's going to save us and prevent future costs from occurring over the long term, so that this is an investment in our future and not just a response to our COVID economic recovery needs. Climate adaptation plans, again, is huge. We know that this is going to have a huge, climate change is going to have a huge impact on extreme weather events. Anything that we can do in terms of our COVID response and recovery that meets the needs of job creation and economic stimulus while also making us more resilient to extreme weather, really, really critical, a really great opportunity, and something that really needs to be a lens that we apply to our COVID economic recovery. Really want to kind of highlights in terms of, I really want to kind of highlight the corporate nights. I really developed a Building Back Better analysis. I really encourage you to check it out. Really did a lot of economic analysis of how if we use this opportunity to invest in our future, how we can save ourselves, not only in terms of extreme weather events and lives saved, but also in terms of economic costs over the long term. So again, I think one of the things we really do also need to be very conscientious about this, and this was a lens that we needed to apply. We need to identify, not that there's, we need to kind of identify how we're doing, if we're going to make investments now that will make our climate change challenge ahead of us more challenging. The investments we make now are going to be with us for almost a 10-year time period for all of the 2020s, and the choices we make will inform the decisions we make throughout that time period. So this is a really, really critical time to making sure that the investments we make are not doubling down on the issues, on the challenges we face on climate change. I can't speak. I'm not going to go too much into this one. We are still struggling to try and wrap our heads around the waste management one, and we're working on that one. Certainly our zero waste efforts have taken a bit of a kick in the gut from the COVID perspective, but we also recognize that our waste management challenges are something that we still need to deal with, and we need to really think this through. But again, it is the kind of things we know that the acute public health response that we need to do is something that we need to work on, and that's something that takes precedence. But we also know we need to start planning for how do we actually manage our waste associated with COVID and not exacerbate our waste management challenges that were already pretty challenging to begin with. So really, that's just what I wanted to provide you a highlight. I wanted to give you an overview of the climate lens. I also wanted to kind of highlight, please do feel free to reach out to me. I'm going to give you my, I think I didn't put it on that slide, but it's GKALAPOS@cleanairpartnership.org. Again, all of our contact information is up on our website. I really encourage you to check out our website. And if you have any questions or wanting some more information on this, there is a much larger COVID and climate lens PowerPoint that we're using to kind of track all of the wonderful input that is being provided by municipal staff across the province to really help everyone collectively apply a climate lens to our COVID actions and to be able to address not only our shorter term COVID challenges, but also to prepare ourselves for the longer term climate change challenges and to be able to respond to them as well. So I thank you very much for choosing to check out this this PowerPoint presentation and recording, and I hope you have a great AMO conference.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to present here at AMO. My name is Kara Clareman. I'm the president and CEO of Plug and Drive. And I'm going to be speaking to you today about electric vehicles in a municipal context, and happy to take any and all of your questions afterwards. I like to start with just the reason we're even talking about electric vehicles in the context of climate change. And this is the main reason why. Transportation, especially here in Ontario, actually is the largest emitting sector in our province, and actually in most provinces it's number 1 or number 2, but in particular it's number 1 here in Ontario, and that makes reducing emissions from transportation critical if we want to achieve our climate change goals. And interestingly, here in Ontario, electricity at one time was the largest emitting sector. And of course, Ontario went off coal a number of years ago, and now Ontario's electricity grid is relatively clean. So this just gives you an idea of Ontario's electricity sources, and the bulk of our electricity comes from nuclear and hydro, a little bit of renewables, and a little bit of natural gas at the peak. And so we actually have a huge opportunity here in Ontario because our electricity is so low emitting, and actually it's typically lowest emitting at night because natural gas tends to only run at the peak time, which is usually in the middle of the day. And so electric cars actually offer us this great opportunity to take a huge bite out of the transportation emissions by essentially fuel switching from gas to electricity. And when are people going to plug in their electric cars? Typically at night when they're at home, when the electricity grid is about 95% greenhouse gas free. So really huge benefit to the environment to switch to an electric car. So that is really the reason we're even talking about electric cars so much as a solution to climate change. And just by the way, you know, we often hear, well, okay, it might make sense in a province with clean electricity, but wouldn't make sense in other places. And just to let you know that in fact, it pretty much makes sense in every jurisdiction, even if the electricity sources are fossil fueled. And the reason is the whole grid is never 100% fossil. Like even in Alberta and Saskatchewan, there's, you know, some hydro and some wind and some other things on the grid. And typically a large fossil fuel plant, whether it's gas or coal, is more efficient than a tiny internal combustion engine. So you still get an improvement. You don't get this kind of 90 to 95% improvement that you get here in Ontario, in British Columbia, Quebec, you know, many of the Canadian provinces that are hydro or nuclear and hydro based, but you still get an improvement. So that's what Plug and Drive is all about. Just 1 minute on Plug and Drive. This is actually our EV Discovery Center in Toronto. If you haven't been there, you gotta go. We are open on an appointment-only basis now. We've been doing that for about a month. It's working extremely well. We have very strict hygiene practices, and we have that all posted on our website. So if you are interested in test driving an electric car, we have all the makes and models there to test drive and learn about in a no pressure to buy anything environment. So if you just want to learn and you want to figure out whether an EV is for you, this is the place to go. We've been in the EV education space for about 10 years, and this is year 3 for the EV Discovery Center, which was the first place of its kind in the world. And so we're lucky to have it here in Toronto, so please do visit us if you're in Toronto at any time. We also, of course, during COVID, we're closed for events, and hopefully at some point we'll be able to open up, but great place to host an event. Actually, many municipalities have hosted events at the EV Discovery Center, and we hope we'll be able to host you again soon. Okay, so we've done a lot of research around the barriers to EV adoption, and of course those barriers continue to exist, but we're breaking them down slowly, and there's many reasons why they're reducing. But we had set this ambitious goal to sort of work with the province to achieve 5% by 2020. We're in 2020, and actually we got so close to this number just prior to the Ford government being elected. And then when they canceled all the different climate change programs, including the funding for EV subsidies, this goal took a hit. So we're not on track to hit this number now, although now we are seeing good increases in EV adoption, but certainly we had a setback there. But when you look at all the research, there are basically 2 main barriers remaining to EV adoption. And the first one kind of a compilation of a bunch of issues, but you can sum them up as consumer education, consumer knowledge. And basically what we find is even though EVs have been in the market for almost 10 years, we still have people who really don't understand the benefits. They don't understand that they're going to save money. They don't understand what makes and models are available. They don't think that it can work for them because they just don't have the information. So that still remains a significant problem. And it's often because still a lot of dealers do not have any, or they might have one. And then the second issue that remains is range anxiety. I'm sure you've heard this expression, which is people having a fear that they're going to be out there driving and they're going to run out, and where are they going to charge the car? Now, the stats will tell you this is sort of more psychological than real, because most of us drive about, on average, about 50 kilometers a day. So most of us are never going to actually experience range anxiety, but it's something people think is going to happen. And people are very much focused on a 1 or 2 time a year road trip, as opposed to what they do every single day. And so we work with consumers around, well, what is their actual commute? What are they doing daily? And not to kind of fixate on a once a year or twice a year trip to dissuade you from choosing an EV. Further, I actually think range anxiety is going away as an issue because the batteries are getting bigger. So the range is getting longer. There's more makes and models. There's a lot more charging stations out there than there used to be. So for all these reasons, I think in the next couple of years, we won't even be talking about range anxiety anymore. But for now, it still remains an issue. And even if it's not real, it's believed. So it does affect people's adoption rates. So just to sum up, you know, the benefits of electric cars before we sort of get into the municipal context. As I said, you're going to drop your greenhouse gas emissions by at least 90%. You're going to save money because electric cars are much, much cheaper to run than gas cars. Even though electricity prices have gone up a little and gas prices have gone down, we still see a significant difference between the price of gas and the price of electricity. And there'll always be a significant difference because of the way electricity prices are regulated. So on average, the average driver is going to save about $2,000 a year, and that's on fuel, you know, plus maintenance. There's very little maintenance with these cars. They have fewer moving parts. So, so there's a big money saving there. For the most part, people only charge once a week because we don't drive that far, most of us, and there are a lot more makes and models than people know. So right now in Canada, there's more than 40. That's 40. And more every week. You might have seen yesterday a new EV was launched in Canada called the Cadillac Lyric. So every week you see an announcement about a new car coming out, pickup trucks are coming. So all these things help make it easier for people to make the switch. Okay, so I want to just spend a few minutes on municipal fleets because I thought that would be very relevant to this crowd. And I thought the best place to start is a study that was done of a series of Ontario municipalities. If you're interested, the study is available online. It's called EV300. And it basically took a look at the benefits for fleets of driving electric, and they actually data logged a bunch of gas vehicles and compared what would, you know, made sure the duty cycle would work with an electric car, and they did a whole bunch of math to figure out, like, okay, what would for these actual vehicles in an actual municipal fleet, and how far they drive every day, and which vehicles could realistically be subbed in for them. What would people save both in money and in emission reductions? And the results were really, really compelling. What they found was that the average driving distance for the fleet vehicles, that's in all those municipal fleets I just showed on the previous slide, was about just over 50 kilometers a day, which actually is about the average of the average Canadian as well. And when they looked at how much you spend on gas for 100 kilometers, the cost was about 1/3 for electricity versus gas. So already a huge savings, and that doesn't even take into account maintenance because this was just a snapshot study. And then in terms of emission reductions, it was 1/10. So huge emission reductions and huge cost savings. So I think, you know, this kind of study, it is a little bit out of date now, it's 2015, but it just shows that the value is there for the municipal fleet. And it's really worth taking a look at whether your fleet could take advantage of some of this. And they did, you can see if you want to dig into the results more, I'm happy to share a link. and send you in the right direction. But the key takeaway shows that they only subbed in a full electric vehicle in cases where the vehicle's duty cycle worked, and then they used a plug-in hybrid in the cases where that might not be the case, and you still see significant savings even with a plug-in hybrid. So really, really compelling results to show that municipalities have a lot to gain. And of course, many of your municipalities have declared a climate emergency and have set ambitious goals, and really you can't achieve them without somehow looking at your fleet. So now it's going to just point out a few interesting examples in Ontario of fleets that have set their own ambitious goals, and it'll be fun to watch what happens over the next number of years. And there are many around the province who've done similar things, but I just picked out a couple of examples that I know a lot about. Kingston has set some really ambitious goals to both electrify its vehicles in its utility fleet, as well as the municipal fleet, as well as its busing fleet. So they have a goal to achieve these switch over by 2022. That's only 2 years away. So it'll be really fun to watch what Kingston does. Edmonton also published an EV strategy in 2018, and they have a goal to get 40 electric buses. So you'll see a lot of the municipal goals don't just look at their own fleet, but they look at the transit fleet as well. They also have an infrastructure goal. They put charging stations in public places like libraries, and they actually, this is interesting, this is a more unique thing that Edmonton is doing. They've purchased conversion kits for some of their existing pickup trucks because there aren't really EV pickup trucks available yet, which I thought was pretty neat. And so again, just not in Ontario, but just an example of what can be done with fleet vehicles, where people say, oh, well, there's no good substitute with it. The conversion, actually, I think they did the math and they still showed that it would pay, that there was a payback on this. Closer to home, here in Toronto, where I'm based, they also published a strategy in 2018, and they had the goal that they've set for 2030 of 45% of the city fleet made up of low carbon vehicles. That means like BEVs and PHEVs, of full battery electrics and plug-in hybrids. They already have a number of vehicles, as you can see in the third point down, actually. They've installed charging stations, and now they're working with the TTC on electric busing. So kind of a strategy again, fleet, transit. And finally, just wanted to point out an interesting project that involves 2 municipalities here in Ontario, both Markham and Mississauga, working with Electra, which is their local utility. And they've created a partnership where they're doing a workplace charging program, which is quite unique. Again, if you're interested, I can get you a lot more information, but it's a 2-year pilot. We're in the 2nd year now. And basically they launched it at the head office of the city of Markham, like the Markham Civic Center, and they had 17 charging stations, battery storage, and integration into the building. And they were kind of monitoring how are people using their EV charging in the day. Could they charge up those backup batteries at night and offer that in the day? Would that help the building manage its energy needs? And the second phase is 7 more stations with battery storage, as well as solar carport, and to include the electric corporate office in the city of Mississauga. So they are looking at smart charging to be able to, control the time of day, etc. This was more based on the idea that there was going to be time of use pricing. So a little bit different now, because during the pandemic we have flat rates here in Ontario, but nevertheless we should see results out of this study at the end of 2020. So really interesting project being put together by Electra and 2 municipalities. And finally, although this is a company program, I thought it would be relevant because they are working with their local municipality. Cascade, which makes recycled paper, you may have heard, has probably the most progressive EV policy, a company that I've heard of here in Canada. And they're basically, they installed a whole bunch of workplace chargers at their own site, started in Quebec, which is in Laval, and then expanded it to their Ontario location. but they also offer an actual vehicle incentive. So if their employees switch to an electric car, they get $2,000 towards that purchase, and their local municipality actually is matching that $2,000. So that's $4,000 off the price of an EV, and that's in addition to whatever provincial incentives are available. And Quebec still has provincial incentives. So this is a huge, I believe Quebec's incentive is still $8,000. So that's a huge amount of money off the price of an EV, and they've already encouraged more than 160 of their employees to switch, and they've put over 100 level 2 stations at their 2 sites. So I would really see them as a leader, and it just gives you an idea of what can be done if the leadership is there and if the motivation is there. And actually, there's some studies now showing, if you pay your employees for their kilometers, you can also save a lot with EV charging at work, because the cost of charging the EV is so much less than what you're paying, let's say 50 plus cents a kilometer for your employees to travel if they do travel. So this is actually like a huge benefit in the end to Cascade and a benefit to the environment. So really, really worth looking into this if you're trying to sort of take a leadership position in this area. Okay, so that sort of gives you the municipal context, some of what the different municipalities across Ontario are doing. As I mentioned, a big part of all this, if you are going to look at EVs for your fleet, you're going to have to think about charging at work. And Plug and Drive has put a guide together. We just launched it a couple of months ago, called Lead the Charge, which has all what you need to know about putting in workplace charging, and there is a lot to know. And what we find is a lot of organizations, municipal or corporate, end up having to devote an individual to this for a year to figure it out. And so we don't think that's worthwhile. That's constant reinventing of the wheel. So we put this guide together to help walk people through what they need to know, which is, how do you assess the workplace? How do you figure out the demand? How many chargers? Which chargers? How do you select the right charging equipment for you? Is it going to be for the visitors? Is it going to be for the fleet? Is it going to be for the employees? Is it going to be for everyone? All the different electrical considerations for installation, the cost. Are you going to charge people, or is it going to be free? And just a whole variety of operational and maintenance considerations. So if you're interested in the guide, you can email us at info@pluganddrive.ca. We can send you a link to purchase the guide. It's a very low cost thing. And just to follow on why workplace charging really is so important, if you do have any kind of EV strategy or an intention to have an EV strategy, you should really think about this as part of it. Workplace is always the second most important location after home if you survey people. They want to feel, we talked about range anxiety already, they want to feel comfortable that they're going to drive to work and drive back. And even if they don't need that workplace charging for their range, it gives them the comfort that it's going to be fine. Especially on days where they think they might want to go somewhere after work. That's not their typical routine. So people always rank it as the second most important charging place. Recent study in California showed that employees are 6 times more likely to adopt an EV if there are chargers at their workplace. And that's both because of, again, that comfort thing I just spoke about, but also because they speak to their colleagues, some of their colleagues do it, and that's very influential. We find that people like to learn about EVs from a friend or colleague or family member, not from an automaker. So that's another reason. The other reason workplace charging is so important, especially in big cities, is that a lot of people live in apartments or condos, and EV charging is more complicated there and maybe not possible for some people. So the workplace charger makes it possible for someone to have an EV who can't get a charger at home. We call these garage orphans, or people who just simply don't have an opportunity to charge overnight at home. And a couple of course additional reasons is, employee engagement, attracting and retaining talent. People now want to work for an organization that cares about the environment and is socially responsible. So this can be part of your sustainability or wellness program, or environmental program, whatever you have. And it also helps your organization achieve whatever its climate goals might be. And most of you in municipalities will have those. Finally, it's not just an environmental issue, it's also a health issue. We know a lot of our air pollution comes from cars, and actually I have a really recent study to show you towards the end of this talk that actually gives you the numbers on that, and it's quite compelling that actually switching to an EV makes a huge difference in your local city's air pollution. I do want to make you aware of a program that we're running that you might want to take advantage of, either for your municipality or for your citizens who live within your territory. We are running a used EV program that actually we're doing that in partnership with the Clean Air Partnership, and Gabby's one of the presenters in this panel. With the support of the MH Brigham Foundation, who is funding this program, we are offering a $1,000 incentive if you choose a used EV. And the great thing about used EVs is now there are more and more makes and models available. There's a lot more available than you might think. They're very affordable. So it gets us away from this narrative that people like to say, well, EVs, they're for the elite, they're so expensive. Used EVs are not expensive, and it allows people to get into the EV market at a very low price, sort of an equity issue. And so we like to say, you know, it makes it possible that EVs are for everyone. So not only are we offering $1,000 off the used EV, but if you scrap your old gas car and buy a used EV, you get an extra $1,000. We're doing this in partnership with Car Heaven, which is a program being run by the Auto Recyclers of Canada. So we get a certificate that the car has actually been scrapped, so we know it's off the road, so you get an even bigger environmental benefit. And that's why our funder has agreed to add $1,000 for anyone who does both, scrapping an old gas car and buying a used EV. So these are really two great programs that exist here in Ontario. They'll only exist as long as the money lasts, and anyone can take advantage of them. So I just encourage you to take a look. It can be used for fleet. You'd be surprised how many fleets are starting to think, hey, like, maybe we could use a couple of used EVs in our vehicle fleet if they still meet the range requirements we need, and we could save a pile of money. So you should take that into consideration. And so this, I'm just going to sum up with my optimism around EVs. We're up to over 5 million worldwide, and we see all predictions is that's going to double annually, and we're going to be at the 60 million mark, you know, by 2030 or sooner. We also see the charging networks being expanded all across Canada. When you see Petrocan and Shell getting into the game, you know that they see it actually now as a serious threat to their business model. We actually now see many jurisdictions banning gas cars by a certain date, especially in Europe. And so it's not an if anymore, if EVs will take off and replace gas cars. It's all just a matter of when. And even the most sort of intransigent auto analyst will acknowledge now that it's just a matter of time. The only disagreement is how long it will take. And we're seeing every automaker throw billions of dollars towards their EV fleet. We don't see all the results of that yet, but we are in the next few years going to see a massive, massive increase in EV adoption. And Plug and Drive is just there to try to make that happen a little bit sooner than it otherwise would. I don't really think we have any time to waste given the climate crisis that we're facing. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not just about the environment, actually a huge health issue as well. And so I just wanted to close with this really interesting study that was just put out a month or two ago by Environmental Defence and the Ontario Public Health Association that did a modeling exercise to say what would happen if all the cars and SUVs in the GTHA were electrified. And this is what they found. They found that the savings would be huge, that the environmental benefit would be huge, and that our health benefit would be massive. And we all, you know, the pandemic did show us one thing, which was when people stopped driving, the air quality improved a lot. And we thought, wow, like maybe we can keep this good air quality with a combination of walkable, bikeable cities, as you heard from Jamie. And if you are going to drive, that you switch to an EV, we can really do our local environment and our global environment a big favor by switching to electric cars. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge and thank the sponsors that make Plug and Drive what it is. We wouldn't be able to function without. We're not for profit. These folks are all the people who make our work possible. As you can see, it's mostly electricity generators and distributors and automakers, as well as folks who make charging stations. And we really appreciate their support to help us do what we do. So thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'd be more than happy to take any questions that you have.
So hello everyone. Today I'm going to be speaking about better broadband infrastructure and how broadband actually supports and enables resilience and response to climate change. My name's Helen Hambley. I'm a professor at the University of Guelph, and I prepared this presentation with one of my team members in the Regional and Rural Broadband Project, David Warden. So I will take you through some of the issues, some of the evidence for work in this area, and basically get to this core question: why better broadband? Why better broadband? Why now? And why in the face of the climate change challenge? Well, first of all, I think we're all very much aware that being able to develop further resilience and to recover from the current COVID-19 pandemic, as well as crises facing us like climate change today, really are an issue of having a strategy in place for sustainable growth and equitable growth. And this strategy is often known as B3, or Build Back Better. And my argument really is that broadband is going to help us to build back better. It is a triple win, in my opinion, that enables us to make environmental gains and benefits, to support the economy, and to achieve social goals like health and education and inclusion of everyone in this new future. But my point really is to just focus in on why broadband is essential in this context. Broadband is another word for high capacity internet, or higher speed internet. Many of us know it as infrastructure that's supported by fiber optics, but also next generation wireless technologies like 5G. And broadband is enabling us in almost all aspects of our lives as individuals, but also as families and communities, as businesses, including those in the rural areas like farms, public organizations like municipalities, and workplaces that involve interactions and partnerships, as well as networks of organizations, in fact, entire social systems. And all of us are being called upon to direct our efforts to this Building Back Better initiative. So going forward, we need better broadband. That is that digital technology and telecoms infrastructure, but a lot more as well. Telecoms is really enabling connections between people, deeper communication, interaction, including web and internet interactions. And these function every single day of our lives in our workplaces. But the internet and the infrastructure behind it is really also influencing us as human beings in our interactions with the natural environment. Everything we do about agri-food systems is changing in the era of digital agriculture technologies that are riding on broadband infrastructure, water resources and their sustainable management, and also a host of other ecosystem services. So let's think a little bit more about how broadband also supports this focus on ecosystem services, their sustainability, and the transitions that they're going through, whether it's something like smart bike lanes, autonomous vehicles, and e-fleets of municipal vehicles, or operations within our businesses, our families, our communities. What we know is that there's a few examples out there to look at, and they're fairly inspiring. This is a schematic of one example that we call the connected farm. So in our research project, we started to envision schematically or visually what's actually happening on farms these days when digital and connected services become available. Well, as this picture shows, we're actually seeing the farm enter the age of cloud computing. These days, all of the operations within a lot of the larger barns, like robotics, automation, barn heating, cooling, water use systems, are all more efficiently managed through digital technologies. Energy production on farm is also possible now. Many of us know that if we drive through rural areas, we'll see large solar generation farms, so solar farms. And in fact, solar farming was one of the first drivers for connectivity into the last mile or into these rural areas of Ontario. We're also going to see moving forward intelligent fleet management of transport vehicles. Those are the vehicles that are bringing food to supermarkets or to farmers markets across the province, as well as a whole set of virtual or invisible services, e-services for farms that are working with bigger data that might come down from the cloud into the tractor, for instance, for intelligent and automated systems. So the connected farm really gives us a look at what might happen in the future, what's happening now, it's already evolving in fact, and what this might mean for sustainable food production, for more efficient energy use, for smart transportation and all sorts of business operations. What we know in the area of rural broadband is that the infrastructure is going to have to change fairly quickly. What we know is that it's a geospatial challenge where one area of Canada or even one area of Ontario faces challenges not seen in another area. We live in a vast nation, but where you live in Canada really defines your access to digital infrastructure like broadband technology. In southwestern and southern Ontario, we know that there is a population density and an effective demand available to actually purchase and use digital services. And this has been the market condition that a lot of private sector providers, the internet service providers, have responded to. So population density and the market demand, of course, are the conditions that they're looking for. And so bringing private services into an area, whether it's by a smaller telecom provider or a larger telecom provider, has often made the best and market sense. But in rural areas and in more dispersed population, it's a much more challenging situation. If their communities are smaller, if they're more dispersed, they're more remote, we know in Canada that the services are much inferior quality than what is in the urban areas. In Toronto today, 1 gigabit synchronous speeds, that means 1 gigabit down, 1 gigabit up, unlimited plans are available for users. But in a lot of smaller communities, even some mid-sized peri-urban communities, like where I live, these kinds of services are a dream still. What are we going to do moving forward by building back better to overcome this population density bias? And that to me is a good opportunity to think through the future of digital services in Canada. What we have to do is we have to put a lot less emphasis on individual consumers and a lot more value on the ecosystem services that are being digitized and supported by broadband infrastructure. These generate economic and social benefits for the entire economy, from which we all will benefit. So moving forward, what can researchers like myself, municipalities do? How do we make the convincing arguments that broadband will help us to build back better out of the COVID-19 pandemic and to respond to challenges like climate change? Well, let me first of all point to some data, some things that we already seen happening here in Ontario. The next slide I'm going to show you has some data from 2 studies that the R2B2 project that I coordinate has done with 2 larger regions, Halton region and Durham region. And our work focuses here on 2 particular aspects of blending environmental and economic and social benefit, which is telecommuting, the ability to be able to work from home more than 1 day per week, by definition, and the mitigation of greenhouse gases through carbon emissions. So in this next slide, you can see comparisons of the telecommuter surplus as it's known. This is the net private benefit to each telecommuter within a residence from being able to have the connectivity to be able to work from home. Of course, most of us are working from home right now during COVID-19, so telecommuting has become our day-to-day reality. But in the Halton region data set, we collected data in that study prior to the COVID-19. In Durham region, it's quite recent. It's this spring into the current summer right now that this data has been generated. What we can see is that for the first telecommuter in the household, the average savings per year in Halton region is around almost $16,000, so $15,929 a year. For the second telecommuter in the same household, an additional $12,500. This is money in the pocket. This is a net private benefit of being able to keep your vehicle and yourself off the road and being able to work from home. So the economic argument for being able to telecommute is certainly evident if you have that broadband capacity to support being able to telecommute efficiently. The other thing that we see is that it can actually vary quite substantially region to region, municipality to municipality. In Durham region, so the other side, east of the GTA, you're seeing even higher telecommuting surpluses, so upwards of $19,000 on average. So this is important to recognize that the telecommuting benefit is also not possible to generalize. It's very locally specific, but it is quite substantial. The other thing we've been able to look at with the data sets around broadband and what it enables is the benefit to the environment. So for the first time in this first study in Canada, we've been able to estimate the annual environmental benefit in terms of the carbon dioxide saved by taking the vehicles off the road and being able to telecommute. And this is quite substantial if you consider the number of thousands of telecommuters across Ontario, particularly in the Southern Ontario regions. So together, the combination of an economic win and environmental win is certainly possible with better broadband. The big question that we're all looking at now with COVID-19 is what is the social equity? What is the social benefit associated with telecommuting? Because some of us, by the nature of our jobs, but also the nature of our own relationships within the household and our own socioeconomic positions, may not be able to telecommute. So we have to go into this data in more detail as we move forward in the project to look at social equity as being the third pillar of a triple win of better broadband supporting telecommuting in Ontario. Many of us who are interested in infrastructure issues and greening of the infrastructure and that we're using for our economy, our society, our environment, are also aware that not all infrastructure carries the same environmental weight. In fact, fiber optic networks and wireless networks are some of the least expensive per kilometer infrastructure builds. But building back better is not just about the per dollar cost per kilometer of the infrastructure. It's also making sure that we adopt procedures and policies that make sure that we do the least amount of disturbance of our natural environments. And so that's why our project and many advocates in the area of rural broadband also advocate for a municipal dig once policy, a policy that communities like Pickering and Kingston and a few others have developed to guide decision-making in the municipal sector to be able to say, once you open that ground, even if fiber optic cabling is not foreseen, make sure that you lay the necessary technology and infrastructure beforehand. So one day it could be lit up and could be available to that neighborhood or to that community. So the dig once policy is certainly a hot topic right now. It's a hot topic because it saves money, but it also might save costs to the natural environment. So another win-win here to look at in more detail as we go forward. Of course, there are many other challenges facing rural broadband today. It's been a long and challenging struggle since the late 1990s, many policy statements, many words spoken, a lot of action still missing on the ground. The federal level, the provincial level, the municipal level all work together in the public sector to support better broadband, but they do so with the private sector, with the ISPs or the telecoms companies themselves. The federal level is needed because they develop the national strategy that's currently missing for rural and remote communities to gain the connectivity that they need despite a lot of recent statements from the Officer of the Auditor General and also the Federal Minister of Rural Economic Development. We're not seeing the progress we need in Canada and in Ontario on rural broadband. Although there's been a lot of words to commit that all Canadians should have connectivity equal in the rural areas, equal to the urban areas, the targets have been still set fairly low, so that by 2030, we're expected to have 90% of Canadians served at 50/10. Well, at that point, the digital divide with those users in downtown Toronto who receive 1 gigabit synchronous service is even going to be wider. So we need to start strategizing and moving this effort for better broadband forward. And of course, with current crises upon us, it's even more important to do so. And I can't wrap up or finish thinking about this topic and presenting on it today without mentioning the smaller municipalities who really struggle in the current context of being able to compete for existing public funds from the federal and provincial governments. There's a type of divide and conquer where municipalities are practically competing against each other for a fairly limited amount of funding to generate public-private partnerships for better broadband. So we need to look at that situation and look at the administrative load that some of the current programs are having. Also look at regional collaborations that enable us to achieve better broadband. There's a few across Ontario that I want to point out, and the one project that we work with fairly closely is SWIFT. This is the Southwestern Integrated Fiber Technology Initiative of the Western Ontario Wardens Caucus. This is data from the Southwestern Ontario, Niagara, and Caledon area that shows the underserved premises in Ontario where connectivity is concerned. Right now, there are 100,000 that are partially served at the 50 megabits per second download, 10 megabits per second upload target from the federal government. And as you can see, this is a concern where the natural environment and also social equity is concerned, because many of the smaller and environmentally important areas of this region are left out of the broadband picture. You can see it in this visualization a little bit more closely. Around the Guelph area, we have some very important large farms that are off the broadband grid, relying on wireless and limited wireless plans. Happy to even get 3 and 4G sometimes level service that many urban users take for granted. Need for new fiber build-outs are apparent across Southwestern Ontario, and SWIFT is moving forward to get connectivity improved. But this has to speed up, and we know this is essential, not just because of the challenges facing us with the pandemic, but also because of climate change, where some of these environmentally sensitive areas are facing major disruptions and challenges. Municipalities are going to play an absolutely crucial role, as I said, in the way forward. Building back better with broadband is going to implicate all aspects of our communities, and our municipalities are poised to do this, but they need capacity development as well to be able to respond to both funding programs, but also the development of digital strategies for sustainability transitions. Everyone's basic needs are now being mediated by digital technology. And so if we have inequity or if we have digital divides in this situation, there's going to be many who find their basic human needs compromised. Evidence is growing that coming out of the pandemic is very deeply connected to whether or not you have access to higher speed internet. So in conclusion, let's build back better with broadband. Let's strengthen those positions that the municipalities have taken to achieve better broadband within their communities, and to collaborate regionally as in joint initiatives. Let's make sure that the scarce public funds that are out there are allocated efficiently and fairly. Let's make sure that the triple win is in those programs so that we gain economic and social benefits, but also environmental benefits moving forward in this context of climate change and the resilience that we need to respond to what will be new environmental challenges coming down the line. And let's make sure that the subsidies that are offered to private sector companies, those partnerships that are essential with their involvement, are monitored, that contractual agreements are honored, and that those agreements are the highest quality possible. Let's make sure that we're always conscious that market forces won't serve underserved areas, especially the rural areas, and that special effort is needed in that direction. And if we can overcome these challenges and also engage together as partners, including university scientists, we know that going forward, we can look at how we can be more resilient to the climate change crisis and create responsive innovation during the pandemic and beyond it. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation. We're always available if you have questions at the R2B2 project at the University of Guelph. You can certainly reach out to us. I want to acknowledge the collaborations that we have with Halton Region, Durham Region, City of Kingston, City of Hamilton, and of course with SWIFT. And I want to encourage everyone to build back better as we get through this pandemic and through strategizing how we're going to respond to climate change, and make sure that broadband's part of that. Thank you very much.